Today we're going to talk about the 24th principle, which says a free people will not survive unless they stay strong. What kind of strength are we talking about here? Huh? Military strength, right? Be able to defend yourself. Well, it's kind of interesting that the founders, in setting up their free civilized society, knew that something was going to happen if you set people free, protect their rights, and if the people stay moral and virtuous, which was a requirement, what would happen in that kind of a society? What would happen in a free, civilized, moral society? There would be great what? Prosperity. That the people would prosper. This nation is going to become prosperous. And they knew that. Have they been proven right? Oh yes. The United States has not only become prosperous, it has become super prosperous. You remember we went from ox carts to where? Walking on the moon in less than 200 years. And while the rest of the world, through the over 5,000 years before, just kind of didn't make much progress. Something happened. And they knew that something great and glorious was going to happen. Well, they also knew that once you're very prosperous, what are other people going to try to do? Whether it's individuals or nations, what would they do? Trying to take it. In other words, prosperity will attract what? Predators. And I mean, we've talked about this as individuals. You build up something or create something, and if it were not for law, which kept order and protected your rights, what would happen? Somebody would come along, or some group of gang members would come along and take it. Same things happen in a nation. If a nation is very prosperous, there are others out there who would say, we want what you've got, and we're going to come and take it. And so that scenario being the case, the founders knew that you would have to provide as a constitutional requirement a defense of the nation that really is second to none. Now the question becomes, how much defense? What would you say? How much defense does a nation need? Enough to protect? Enough to fight off? Okay. Is that after somebody attacks you, enough to fight them off? Could any more defense create a better situation? What would it be? Be prepared? All right. To have enough defense so that others looking at you would say what? Oh, yeah, forget it. I'm not going to do that. We're not going to do that. There is no way in the world we could beat the United States. In other words, you have to have enough defense to discourage attacks. That was the founders' philosophy. I want to read, let's go to page 260 and read some of Franklin's philosophy on defense. He gave this paragraph, the first one there on 260, in 1747. How many years was that before the Constitution was written? 40 years before. See, Franklin had always, for 50 years, he had wanted to put a union together. He's always talking about this. In 1747 he says, "Were this union formed, were we once united, thoroughly armed and disciplined, were everything in our power done for our security, as far as human means and foresight could provide, we might then, with more propriety, humbly ask for the assistance of heaven and a blessing on our lawful endeavors." I get from that, there's two requirements Franklin is saying need to be in a defense of a nation, in a proper defense. Sometimes we forget about one of these. Two necessary things. What's he saying? First thing we have to do is be what? We have to be virtuous. We have to be good enough to do what? to humbly ask the assistance of heaven and a blessing on our lawful desires. Isn't that interesting? That's the first requirement. He's not the only one of the founders that says that. The people have to be good. In order to, George Washington said this a lot, in order to expect providence to help us, we have to be good. And of course, then what would be the other one? We would have to do what? Let's see, did I put that up here? Virtue, and we would have to use all of our means, all of our ability, all of our creativity to be as strong as we can be. At least as strong as necessary to discourage an attack. Does that take creativity? Does that take technology? You bet. And thoroughly armed and disciplined, everything in our power done for our security. What's he basically saying? We have to do everything we can do first, and then we have to rely on and be good enough to receive the blessings of heaven for our defense. Isn't that interesting? Do all in our power and ask for assistance. Now I want you to go to the next paragraph. He writes, "The very fame of our strength and readiness would be a means of discouraging our enemies." What do you think? Could that happen? Could we be so strong and so successful in our military that any nation would say, no, we're not going to touch the United States? See, we could. That's what Franklin is saying. For he says, "'Tis a wise and true saying that one sword often keeps another in the scabbard." Do you believe that? You have a nice shining sword in your scabbard, right? You pull it out, you show it off a little bit, you test the sharpness. You might even test a little bit and, put a Z on something, or just to show that you really know how to use this thing and that you keep it sharp and shiny. You put it in there. What are others going to say or think? I better not mess with him. That's what he's saying, isn't it? One sword often keeps another in the scabbard. The way to secure peace is to be prepared for war, that they that are on their guard and appear ready to receive their adversaries are in much less danger of being attacked than the supine, secure, and negligent. This makes sense, doesn't it? Okay, that's Franklin. And who did he say should be the ones that would make sure we have enough military to protect us? Go to top of page 261. That's correct, government. Protection is as truly due from the government to the people as obedience from the people is due to the government. I mean, that's why we form a union. That's why we form the federal government. Number one, to protect us, to keep a wolf away from the door, so that we could be free without worry. Free to do what? This is kind of an interesting concept. Free to compete for the best level of government that would provide us the most freedom. You keep the wolf away from the door, keep all those people away, and leave us in the states free. That's a great concept. We'll talk more about that later. And so our leaders really do owe us protection. Let's keep on with Franklin here. He says, I'm still on 261, the second quote. He says, "Our security lies, I think, in our growing strength, both in numbers and wealth, that creates an increasing ability of assisting this nation in its wars, which will make us more respectable, our friendship more valued, and our enmity feared. Thence it will soon be thought proper to treat us not with justice only, but with kindness." What does that mean? Who would treat us with justice, not with justice only, but with kindness? Even somebody you might not like. why would you, if they're strong enough, why do you want to treat them with justice? Because you know you can't beat them. So there has to be a certain understanding here of fair play. Why would you perhaps even want to treat them with kindness after a while? Yeah, so they'll be on your side. You may not agree with them on everything, but at least you'll agree with them to the point where they're not going to come after you. What do you think? So he's not talking about with justice only, but with kindness. If you're strong enough. And thence we may expect in a few years a total change of measures with regard to us. See, that was their vision. This is incredible. They're not going to look at us anymore as a nation that they might be able to come in and take some land from, or come over here to our hemisphere and think they can start conquering us. Oh no, they will completely leave us alone. Maybe they'll have a little more respect for us. Franklin says, I think that'll happen. Okay? Then he gives us a warning. Unless by a neglect of our military discipline we should lose all martial spirits and our Western people become as tame as those in the eastern dominions of Britain, when we may expect the same oppressions, for there is much truth in the Italian saying, make yourselves sheep and the wolves will eat you. You believe that? Make yourselves sheep and the wolves will eat you. So, strength helps to make friends of our enemies. It's kind of interesting. You find that in human relationships, don't you? You know, think of the bully. If you're strong enough so that the bully learns that, hey, I better not pick on him, he'll leave you alone. He'll leave you alone first. May even then start to want to have a friendly relationship with you. Anyway, same way with nations. Make yourselves sheep and the wolves will eat you. So the founder said, we cannot be sheep. And Franklin also, on the bottom of 261, he was a little upset because some of the people were apathetic about their military. Do we see this today? Yes. He says, our people certainly ought to do more for themselves. It is absurd the pretending to be lovers of liberty while they grudge paying for the defense of it. That's interesting. A lot of people love liberty today, don't they? But they begrudge paying for it. Well, all right, let's talk about George Washington on defense. I want to ask you, well, why do you think Washington was so strong on building a strong defense?
He's been a general most of his life.
There's probably no one in all of colonial America that knew the necessity of a strong defense than George Washington. He was right in the middle of a what? Of a weak defense. And for example, those of us who have been to New York, New York is surrounded by, mostly anyway, by water. What kind of a defense strategy would work in New York? What kind of military, what? Yeah, something having to do with Navy and ships and so forth. Washington knew with the British Navy around New York, which they were, here's the largest Navy in the world in the New York harbor. What did we have? Nothing. We had no Navy. And so Washington concluded, you cannot win this Battle of New York. He tried a little bit at the beginning, soon found out, He left and in great wisdom knew that he could never really take New York without a Navy, so he never really tried again. And he also had no trained army. When Washington was chosen to be commander-in-chief, one of his first assignments was up at Boston. Well, where's my army? Oh, they'll meet you up there. He gets up there, and what does he see? Bunch of ragtag guys walking around Some with muskets, some without. Who were they? Well, they're people from the farms in the hinterland that heard there was a fight brewing in Boston. Put down the plow, go get the musket off the mantle, and head for Boston. They're all walking around wondering who we're going to fight, who are we going to fight. The British soldiers were out on the island of Boston, which was an island at that time. Who are we going to fight? And Washington comes onto the scene. What do you think he thought? Oh my, this is my army. And it took a while before there was training and order and discipline and so forth in his army. Washington knew the importance of a strong, disciplined army. He also knew the importance of getting support from the states and from Congress, because most of those years he was fighting in the Revolutionary War, he had very little support. Remember, Congress was under the Articles of Confederation. They didn't have the power to what? Tax. You got to have money to fight a war, and if Congress doesn't have the power to tax, where are you going to get your money? And one of the states would say, well, we're not going to send our supplies until the other states send theirs. You just try to fight a war in that situation. And Washington sometimes had to expropriate. What does that mean? Take from some of the farmers and ranchers in the area enough food, mostly cattle and so forth, to feed his army, because he just wasn't getting it from headquarters. I'll pay you back, we'll pay you back, but we got to keep this army going. I'll tell you, there's nobody that knew the necessity of a strong defense more than George Washington. He actually could have been bitter over the things that happened to him in the field. Not only was he fighting the British, he was fighting some of his own officers and some of their treason toward him. He was fighting sometimes with Congress, trying to get them to get more supplies to him. Hopefully one day we'll appreciate more this great man, George Washington. And he was a great man, and probably without him, probably wouldn't have happened like it did. Washington also was strong on a concept, and I want you to turn to, on the bottom of 260, here's a quote: "To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace." Washington would say what? You want to preserve the peace? In other words, you want to have no war? What should you be doing? Preparing for war. Same concept. I want you to turn to, let's see, top of 264. This is Washington, one of his annual addresses to Congress. You know, the President gives an address every year. We call it the State of the Union address. And Washington was in for 8 years, so he gave at least eight messages to Congress, and this is one of them. This happened to be from his 5th annual address. He's trying to get Congress to do something. See if you can tell what he's trying to get them to do. "I cannot recommend to your notice measures for the fulfillment of our duties to the rest of the world without again pressing upon you the necessity of placing ourselves in a condition of complete defense and of exacting from them the fulfillment of their duties toward us." What's he saying here? We must have a better defense. We cannot wait until we're attacked to build up our military. We got to have a more complete defense. You think about this. We have quite a technologically advanced defense nowadays, don't we? Have you been seeing some of these incredible weapon systems that are being used? I mean, an airplane, a jet fighter can release a rocket, or a rocket can even be launched from land, from a ship, or a land-based operation of somehow. And what will happen to it once it's released from the plane or launched? It will lock on to what? Some laser beam, and the beam will direct it right down a chimney or right into a window of a building. pinpoint it right within inches of where it's supposed to hit, after it's traveled hundreds of miles. That's incredible. You don't develop those weapon systems overnight. Somebody attacks us and we say, well, I guess we better get our military going. You're always thinking about that. You're always applying technology in the laboratory to military defense just in case you need it. That's what Washington was saying. Must have a complete defense. Well, he finishes his quote on page 264 by saying, there is a rank due to the United States among nations, which will be withheld, if not absolutely lost, by the reputation of weakness. If we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire to secure peace, one of the most powerful instruments of our rising prosperity, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. I'm going to make a statement here, folks, and if you haven't studied it out, I encourage you to do so. This might sound a little unbelievable to you, but I think in my studies that if we had followed the Founders' formula in every respect, not only in the military, but in other respects, economically, how we treat foreign countries, our foreign relations that we'll talk about in the next principle, and in other ways, if we would have followed the Founders' formula, I believe we would have had to fight very few wars, many less than what we have had to fight. And as you click through the wars, I believe almost every one of them could have been avoided. Now, that's a big statement, isn't it? You say, well, what about all these people who are gaining power? What about the Hitlers of the world? Well, you think about the reasons that those kind of people come about. And Principle 28 says if the United States was the proper example, if we had exported freedom so that the whole world's people would be saying, oh, we want to have what the United States have. They are so good and so great and so prosperous. We want to have what they have. Teach us how to do it. And if a tyrant would rise up among them to do something, they would soon dispatch him knowing, hey, you're on the wrong track, buddy. Out of here. As it is, we have actually helped build up some of these people who have turned on us and become our enemies and use the very technology that we helped them build to attack us. And as you study the history of these wars, you have to say to yourself, you know, there's a lot of truth in that. I say again, if we would have followed the Founders' formula, we would have had to fight very few wars because we would do what Washington and Franklin said. We are so strong, nobody would want to attack us. Anyway, let's